Did you know that thousands of New Yorkers are being assaulted every day by constant helicopter noise, all 7 days per week? They have no control over the situation, so they're appealing to local authorities and to their state representatives. They're asking the city to close the city heliports for non-essential flights and to establish some federal regulations to manage the currently unregulated congestion overhead. Soundproof has talked to some representatives of the organization Stop the Chop, New York, New Jersey, to learn more about the problem and what they're doing about it. They'd also like help from the public. You can hear the full interview in episode 24 of the Soundproofist podcast. But here are a few excerpts from our Zoom conversation.
It's a twofold problem. There are the tourists that are flying for sightseeing photographs, and those emanate from various heliports, airports, downtown Manhattan heliport at the Seaport in New York City, and then from New Jersey at Kearny, which is a private airport, some from Linden, New Jersey, and then there are also some from Westchester as well. So those are the commuters. I'm sorry, the tourists. Then we also have the problem with commuter helicopters, and that includes companies such as Blade, Urban Air Mobility, and they're flying to the airports, the local airports. They're flying to the Hamptons, to other Long Island locations. Some of them are flying to DC, Baltimore, and pretty much anywhere else that's commutable. And the paths of these helicopters are disturbing people all over the New York metropolitan region. So it's a vast geographic problem that involves obviously excessive noise pollution, but also air pollution.
I'm going to use at least pre-COVID 2019 numbers, and at least that I have some FAA data on. And so if you go back to pre-COVID times, and I don't think we're radically off from that anymore, but
I think we're higher.
We're higher in some ways. We're certainly higher in people flying over land, which they haven't really been doing as much since 2016. But pre-COVID 2019, we had roughly 30,000 tourist flights out of the downtown Manhattan heliport, which is the only heliport of the 3 New York City heliports that allows what they call tourist flights. So 30,000, that's 30,000 takeoffs, 30,000 landings, or 60,000 operations per annum. Mostly concentrated, I would say, or more concentrated. It runs year round, 12 months, but there's more in the summer and on nice days. And so, when you start to think about when you're going out to enjoy Governor's Island or go to school at the Harbor School, what kind of impact that has on those places. In addition to that, again, going back to the pre-COVID era, we had, I'm going to use very rough terms, about 15,000 flights out of the East 34th Street heliport, which is the other New York City owned heliport, and about the same number coming out of, very roughly, out of the West Side heliport, West 30th heliport, which is located in the Hudson River Park. So that's kind of the environment pre-COVID, and things have shifted around, but the plague has not gotten any better. But if you start figuring how many that is, it's very frequent that I'll pull out my airplane tracking app, which everybody should use if they care about this issue. We recommend something called Flight Radar 24. It has a free version, which is totally adequate for what you need to do to see what it is. I often pull that up and I'll see 8, 9, 10 helicopters, not including also a few small planes, in what I would call the Manhattan airspace. So Manhattan and adjacent waterways. Often 5 of them, let's say up near Central Park or on the adjacent rivers, east and west, and another sort of 5 floating around, usually down around the Brooklyn Bridge and out to the Statue of Liberty and Governor's Island area. But very easy to use, Flight Radar 24. There's a big misconception out there, and I see it every day. I was out talking to people this week in Central Park. There was a movie festival in Central Park this week, and talking to people as they were entering. There were, of course, helicopters hovering over Central Park, and people said, "Isn't that police?" And I'm like, "No, yeah, there are police helicopters that fly in New York City, and there were quite a few of them during the protests at their peak. But 95, and I'm making that number up, it's not scientific, but I would say 95 to 98% of these are non-essential."
The numbers that Andy cited he didn't mention anything also about the helicopters that are leaving from New Jersey heliports.
Right.
So
Linden,
that
you said, right?
so there's Linden, there's Kearney, there's also the airports, right,
Mhm.
where you have, right, the commuters going from JFK, Newark, LaGuardia.
Teterboro.
Also, yeah, to a certain extent. Also, there's the Westchester County Airport that now has a relationship with Blade. So that wasn't even factored in the numbers that he gave you, nor if they're coming from other airports as well or heliports. So it's you, as you can see, just in your mind's eye, right? You have this little area, and I think first of all, it's outrageous that a tiny island like Manhattan has 3 heliports all south of the 30s south, 3 on this very short area of land. And then we also are, having them come from across the river. So, we do show a lot of the screenshots of Flight Radar 24 on our Twitter feed. And you can see how many of those little helicopter icons are simultaneously flying up the Hudson River, which has become a helicopter highway, as well as over the parks, as Adrian had mentioned. And Central Park, where many of us who live on the Upper West Side like to recreate, you can't even jog around the reservoir, the Jackie O Reservoir anymore, because it sounds like a war zone. In fact, that is what brought me into the cause in the first place, because I am a jogger, and I was so disturbed and did think, like Andy was saying initially, that it was the NYPD searching for a missing person until I started asking around, and it's made the parks just unusable.
So let's take the pre-COVID numbers, and this is a number that's been growing, and Blade hopes to, quadruple their business over the next couple of years. So this is not a stable problem or a pre-existing problem for forever and ever. This is a growing crisis. 60,000 flights, which is what we had, and that would be 120,000 operations, right? Takeoff and landings. If we spread that out evenly, that's 1,100 plus a week, 164 per day, 13 per hour. If we assume 12 hours a day, that's every couple of minutes there's a helicopter taking off and landing in New York. Okay, many of which end up hovering over our landmarks and public places. Just to try and sort of frame this with some data.
Let me tell you a little bit about that from the Brooklyn perspective. I go to work every day at Brooklyn Botanic Garden, which at one point was this lovely oasis right next to Prospect Park in the middle of Brooklyn. Brooklyn has 2.5 million residents. If it were its own city, it would be the 3rd or 4th largest city in America. Very densely populated. A lot of the population is poor, people of color. There are 2 primary commuter helicopter routes that go across Brooklyn. One goes sort of east-west from Manhattan to JFK, following a street that's called Eastern Parkway, an old street designed by Frederick Law Olmsted. And the other comes also from Manhattan to go to the Hamptons, and it goes all the way through Brooklyn from the north end to the south end down Flatbush Avenue, which is another major avenue. That avenue, interestingly, that route is known by the FAA as the Parks route. Isn't that sweet? They call it the Parks route because it passes over Brooklyn Bridge Park, Prospect Park, Brooklyn Botanic Garden, Brooklyn's largest park, Marine Park, Floyd Bennett Field, which is part of Gateway National Recreation Area, across Jamaica Bay, and just for added measure, goes over Reese Beach at about 200 feet. So they fly very, very low. In Manhattan, they're flying normally around 1,200 feet, but they come much lower. In Brooklyn, they fly below 800 feet, between 400 and 800 feet, allegedly because they have to stay below the landing airplanes coming into LaGuardia. So we're blessed with those 2 forms of noise. Every 3 minutes, a plane landing at LaGuardia, and then the helicopters flying much lower. And the phenomenon I've noticed is you can have 2 at once, one heading for the Hamptons and one heading for JFK. They're flying at about 600 feet, say. The Sikorskys are extremely loud. They're a twin engine plane. And what you first hear is the echo of the Sikorsky from the apartment buildings facing the garden. And then you hear this thing blasting over you. We have an old building that we work in. The windows rattle in their casements when these Sikorskys fly overhead. So that's bad. It's really bad that our oases are being destroyed by these machines. Even worse, they're flying over some very poor neighborhoods of color. And there's been no environmental impact done on either the noise or the exhaust from the aviation fuel that's dropping every few
Right.
minutes on people's heads and going into people's lungs. The lack of an environmental impact statement on these new routes could be a big Achilles heel, among other Achilles heel, for this terrible industry.
In 1990, the federal government made it near impossible for localities to control in any way, shape, or form their airspace. And while there may be reasons for that, right? You don't want to have someplace in Iowa telling a flight from New York to LA they can't fly over their town. So there's sort of a rationale for it, but when you come to a place like New York City and see what the result is, there needs obviously to be some additional regulation, which doesn't exist. So New York City has no power, nor does any other municipality, to regulate its own airspace. Once something is in the air, it's the FAA and the federal government that control, which is why we are seeking federal legislation to fix this problem. And it has been introduced. We haven't talked about it yet, but there is a bill pending in the House right now that would fix the problem, at least for New York City and its surrounding areas. So that's a problem. New York City does have some control over the heliports because they're on public land. And so we're also asking electeds to see what they can do, which we believe is a lot. They could close the 3 New York heliports if they so choose.
There's two city heliports, the East 34th Street and then the South Street Seaport one, which is DMH, Downtown Manhattan Heliport. And the other one that we had also mentioned before is in the Hudson River Park. So that's a state owned piece of land. There are movements in that neighborhood and with the community board there to close that and to remove the heliport from this park, which is also next to a sailing club close to the Chelsea Piers. It's now, also a very residential neighborhood. There's the bike lane, there's the Henry Hudson Highway. So there's a movement to close that.
It's not just a bike lane, it's the busiest bikeway in the country, runs inches from this heliport. The West 30th heliport is inches from actively operating helicopters. In fact, so close that we're aware of at least 3 lawsuits that have resulted from people being physically blown off of their bicycles while on the bike path.
To put this in a sort of again, a national context, if we think back to the 1950s, we were kind of told that the future for how we live and how we work was going to be living in suburbs and driving into cities, right? So we allowed a huge network of interstate highways to be blasted through the hearts of our cities, which has resulted in the destruction of many downtowns and many beautiful residential neighborhoods. I would say that what's happening with helicopters now is like the 1950s with highways. It is the Wild West out there. The helicopter industry sees this a great opportunity here to take advantage of the fact that there's terrible traffic that people can't resolve.
Andy had mentioned that bill.
Yeah.
So it is one of a couple of pending federal bills in Congress, and it's HR 1643, the Improving Helicopter Safety Act of 2021, first introduced in 2019 after there was a fatal crash in the center of Manhattan. That was a chartered, commuter flight where the pilot crashed and died. A whole building, the Equitable building in Midtown, was evacuated. And right after that, the first iteration, and it's pretty much the same, was introduced by Congress members Maloney, Nadler, and Velasquez. And we've had a couple more co-sponsors. And then, Andy also mentioned that 1990 law. So that's the ANCA law that basically preempts any kind of very local legislation attempt to control for noise pollution, and specifically makes this a national issue. So there's another bill that's on our website. So all the legislation, anything that's pertinent generally can be looked at on our website under the legislation tab. And that's 389, introduced by Hawaiian Congress member Case, plus Jerry Nadler from New York. And if you look at that bill, it's very interesting as well, because it does specifically, and I'll talk about 1643 in a minute, but that specifically also grants local municipalities the power to regulate. So it's basically a response to the 1990 ANCA law, as well as banning helicopter flights over national parks and national cemeteries, wilderness areas, because they're having problems in many of these beautiful national parks with tourist helicopters as well. And then with 1643 and our petition on our website, you can link to it. Our petition is based mostly on 1643, in that we're trying to ban the non-essential helicopters, tourists and commuters, over the New York metropolitan area. And 1643 does that, does not specifically say New York City. And as Adrian had mentioned, this city has helicopter traffic like no other.
Yeah.
Hence the necessary introduction of the bill. And we need and must get that bill passed.
Here's how you can help. Contact your state representatives and ask them to support Federal Bill H.R. 1643, the Improving Helicopter Safety Act of 2021. Visit the Stop the Chop website at stopthechopnynj.org and learn more about their work. You can also make a donation to them through their website. If you live in the New York metropolitan area and you're bothered by helicopter noise, you can file a complaint with 311. You can also download the Flight Radar 24 app to track the IDs of the helicopters over you and their flight paths. And to learn more about noise issues or soundproofing and acoustics, or listen to our podcasts, visit soundproofist.com.